Go to sleep now. My VIP guests are arriving, and I don't want any obstacles in the living room. Robert yelled at me, pushing me by the shoulder toward the dark hallway, while I was still holding the kitchen rag. My name is Eleanor. I am 68 years old, and I have spent a decade baking the bread that others eat. What he didn't know is that the key to the pantry and the weight of this house have always been in my pocket. It had all started many hours earlier, at 4 in the morning, when the December chill was still seeping through the cracks of the kitchen windows. At that hour, the house was submerged in absolute silence. It was the only moment of the day when I felt this place belonged to me again. I got out of bed with the usual ache in my knees, a dull, throbbing pinch that has kept me company for years, but which I learned to ignore because work doesn't wait for the ailments of the old. I put on my worn-out slippers. I tied the wool robe my late husband Arthur gave me on our last Christmas together, and I walked slowly toward my territory. The kitchen was freezing, but it would soon warm up. I flicked on the fluorescent light. It blinked twice before flooding the white tiles. Resting on the center island, massive and pale, was the 22-pound turkey I had been thawing since Tuesday. Next to it, a massive pork roast wrapped in plastic waited its turn. 20 people. That was the number Robert had dropped last week, with the same casualness of someone asking for a glass of water. 20 people from his firm, the new partners, the investors who were going to change his life. Or so he claimed. I washed my hands with freezing water and a bar of soap, feeling my knuckles go numb. I grabbed my blue apron, the one with edges frayed from countless washes, and tied it around my waist. That knot was my battle uniform. I started with the marinade, peeling whole heads of garlic, cracking black pepper, squeezing bitter oranges until the acid burned a small paper cut on my index finger. I dumped it all into the blender with a heavy splash of cheap white wine, apple cider vinegar, cumin, sun-dried oregano, and a handful of kosher salt. The roar of the motor shattered the early morning silence, but I knew no one upstairs was going to wake up. They are heavy sleepers. The kind of sleep reserved for those who know someone else is awake, holding up the world for them. I rubbed the turkey with the mixture, sliding my hands under the cold skin, massaging the meat so the flavor would penetrate straight to the bone. It is physical, heavy labor. My wrists protested with every movement, but I kept going. I thought about Arthur. He used to wake up with me at this hour. He would sit in the corner chair with a mug of black coffee and keep me company. He didn't cook, but he handed me the knives. He told me terrible jokes in a low whisper so we wouldn't wake our daughter Valerie. And when the turkey was ready for the oven, he was the one who lifted it with his strong arms. Now, Arthur has been in the ground for 5 years, and I had to learn to lift the dead weight alone, literally. With an effort that pulled a groan from my chest, I hoisted the aluminum roaster and slid it into the preheated oven. By 6 in the morning, the scent of roasting meat and spices was already filling the house. I sat down for the first time, barely 5 minutes, to drink a cup of cinnamon tea and warm my hands on the ceramic. I looked out the window as the sky began to lighten, painting itself a pale, frigid blue. There was no time to rest. The pork roast needed its own glaze, this time with brown sugar, smoked paprika, cloves, and apple cider. The rhythm started all over again. Chop, blend, massage, bake. At 8, my grandkids came downstairs. Leo, who is 7, and little Mia, 4. They ran into the kitchen in their pajamas, drawn by the heat and the smells. "Smells so good, Grandma!" Leo shouted, wrapping his arms around my legs. The exhaustion vanished for a split second. That is my weakness, my eternal vulnerability. Everything I do, every burn on my arms, every ache in my back, I do for them. I whipped up a quick breakfast, scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and buttered toast. I sat them at the small kitchen table and watched them eat. I had knitted them red sweaters to wear that night. I had spent my November nights knitting in secret to surprise them. At 9, Valerie appeared. My daughter dragged her feet into the room, wrapped in a silk robe, Robert had bought her on one of his business trips. Her hair was a mess, and she had a green clay mask smeared across her face. "Mom, how are we doing on time? Robert is stressing out," she said, pouring herself coffee without looking me in the eye. "The turkey is almost there. Honey, the pork goes in shortly. Still need to finish the desserts, the mashed potatoes, the apple salad, and the baked mac and cheese," I answered, drying my hands on my apron. "Oh, good, because today is a crucial day for him. The owners of the firm are coming. Everything has to be perfect, Mom. Perfect. No chipped plates, okay? The deed to the house is in my name. Arthur and I built it brick by brick, but when he passed, Robert decided it was best if they moved in to take care of me. Over time, they swapped out the furniture, painted the walls cold shades of gray I despise, and relegated me to the back bedroom, the one overlooking the utility alley. I accepted it in silence. I accepted it because I come from that generation of women who believe family peace is worth more than personal pride. I believed that by yielding, by serving, I was keeping the love intact. By 11 in the morning, I started on the desserts. The heat in the kitchen was suffocating, a brutal contrast to the freezing street outside. Working cold butter into the flour until my fingers ached. I peeled 6 pounds of apples, slicing them paper thin, tossing them with cinnamon, brown sugar, and a heavy dash of nutmeg. Then, I started the caramel for the 2 vanilla custards. The boiling sugar spat from the saucepan, and a searing drop landed right on my right forearm. I clenched my teeth, hissed through the pain, and rushed to the sink to run cold water over it. It left a raised, angry red blister, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If the custard wasn't ready on time, it wouldn't set in the fridge. At 1 in the afternoon, Robert made his first appearance in the kitchen. He was dressed in high-end athletic wear, barking into his cell phone with his chest puffed out. He hung up and looked me up and down. I was sweating, my white hair plastered to my forehead, stirring the heavy pot of cheese sauce. "Eleanor," he said, skipping any title of respect, "I hope you have the exhaust fan on. I don't want the house smelling like a cheap diner when the guests arrive." "The fan is on, Robert, but I'm cooking for 20 people. It's going to smell like food," I answered quietly, never stopping my stirring. "Well, open the windows. And please, hide those old chipped enamel pots. I don't want my partners seeing that misery. Use the glass Pyrex dishes we bought last month." I felt a knot form in my stomach, a familiar cocktail of old grief and quiet rage, but I swallowed it down. I walked over to open the window, and the freezing wind slapped my sweaty back, making me shiver. I transferred the food into the glass dishes. Heavy, slippery, exactly the way he wanted them. At 3 in the afternoon, it was time to set the table. The dark wood dining table Arthur bought with his first real Christmas bonus. I went to the hutch and pulled out the white linen tablecloth with the hand-stitched embroidery that belonged to my mother. We only used it on truly special occasions. I draped it over the long table and ran the warm iron directly over the fabric to press out the slightest wrinkle, bending over until my kidneys screamed in protest. Then came the good china. The silver cutlery I had to polish piece by piece with baking soda and lemon because it had tarnished from disuse. I arranged 20 plates, 20 wine glasses, 20 cloth napkins folded into perfect fans. It took me nearly 2 hours to make the dining room look like a 5-star restaurant. By 5, the exhaustion was no longer just physical. It was a heavy fog clouding my vision. The turkey was golden, crispy, immaculate. The pork was resting in its dark, thick juices. The mashed potatoes were whipped with the exact ratio of butter and heavy cream. The mac and cheese, the salads, the dressings, everything was done. I had built it all with my own 2 hands, with my own time, grinding down my own bones. All that was left was to warm the dinner rolls and serve. I went up to my room, that narrow little box next to the laundry area. I sat on the edge of my twin bed and took a deep breath. Every muscle in my body throbbed. The burn on my arm pulsed to the rhythm of my heartbeat. I looked at the dress hanging on the closet door. A burgundy dress, simple but elegant, which I had carefully washed and pressed. My low black heels were waiting. I just needed 10 minutes. 10 minutes to step into the shower, wash the smell of garlic and onions off my skin, put on my dress, brush my white hair, and walk out to welcome Christmas with my family. It was 6:30 when I heard the screaming from upstairs. "Leo, take off that hideous itchy wool sweater right now. You are wearing the button-down shirt I bought you." It was Robert's voice. "But Grandma made it for me," the boy whined. "I don't give a damn. Put the shirt on. Valerie, control your children. For the love of God, my partners are about to walk in." I hadn't even showered yet, but I knew if I didn't intervene, it would escalate, and Valerie would end up in tears. I stepped out into the hallway, my dirty apron still tied around my waist. I headed toward the kitchen for one final check of the ovens. Right then, the front doorbell rang. 7 o'clock on the dot. They were early. Panic detonated inside the house. I heard Robert's frantic footsteps rushing down the stairs, buttoning the cuffs of an immaculate suit. He smelled of an expensive, overpowering cologne that flooded the hallway, erasing the scent of cinnamon from my desserts. Valerie rushed down right behind him in a tight black dress, high heels, and flawless makeup, dragging the kids by the hands. Leo was wearing the stiff shirt his father forced on him, his eyes red from crying. I was standing in the corridor that connects the kitchen to the foyer, right next to the living room. I had a kitchen rag in my hand, wiping the sweat from my forehead. I took a step forward. My intention was simple: open the door, wish the guests a good evening with a warm smile, and then slip quietly back to my room to change. It was my house. It was my food. It was my labor. I wanted to at least say welcome. Robert stopped dead in his tracks when he saw me. His eyes swept over me from head to toe with a disgust he didn't even try to hide. He saw my messy hair, my shiny forehead, my apron stained with meat drippings, the blister on my arm, my slippers. He saw everything I had sacrificed so he could have his perfect dinner, and the only thing he felt was shame. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Lively voices and laughter leaked through the heavy wooden door. I took another step toward the foyer. "I'll get it, Robert." "Don't worry." He shoved me backward, forcing me into the shadows of the kitchen hallway. The push was hard enough to make me stumble. Losing my balance on my aching knees, I grabbed the doorframe to keep from hitting the floor. "Go to sleep now. My VIP guests are arriving and I don't want any obstacles in the living room," he hissed, his voice loaded with venom. Teeth clenched so the people outside wouldn't hear. I froze. The air caught in my throat. I looked into his eyes, waiting to find some trace of remorse, some hesitation. There was nothing, just an urgent need to hide me, just pure, unadulterated contempt. I turned my head slowly to look at Valerie, my daughter, the little girl whose scraped knees I used to bandage, the girl whose college tuition I paid by selling baked goods, the woman for whom I had accepted living in a storage closet. Valerie was standing 6 feet away. She saw the shove, she heard the words, and instead of defending her mother, instead of telling her husband not to lay a hand on me, Valerie lowered her eyes to the marble floor. She pretended to fix the collar of little Leo's shirt. She played deaf, she played blind. Her silence was a second shove, far more violent than Robert's. The doorbell rang for a third time. "Go to your room, Eleanor. You did your part, now disappear," Robert ordered again, letting go of my shoulder and instantly turning his back to me. His furious face miraculously transformed into a massive, plastic smile as he marched toward the front door. "Mr. Morrison, what a pleasure. Come in, come in. Welcome to our humble home," Robert crooned, throwing the door wide open. "Right this way, please. My wife and I have prepared a spectacular dinner for you." I felt something inside me, something soft and warm that I had kept alive for years, out of pure love for my family, dry up instantly. It was a physical sensation, as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over the embers of my heart. All the exhaustion, all the back pain, the sting of the burn vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. They had looked at me like a maid for so long that they forgot who actually owned the house. They forgot that turkeys don't roast themselves, that tables don't set themselves, that the magic holding this family together didn't come from Robert's paycheck, but from my broken hands. They wanted me invisible. They wanted me in the shadows, operating the machinery of their perfect lives without ruining the aesthetic. I looked down at my stained apron. I looked toward the kitchen, where the ovens were still radiating heat, and the food steamed in its pristine glass dishes. Then I looked toward my room at the end of the hall. Slowly, without making a single sound, I reached behind my back. I untied the knot of the blue apron. I let the fabric fall to the floor with a soft hiss. I tossed the kitchen rag on top of it. I didn't say a word. I didn't look back at the brightly lit living room where Valerie was taking the coats of strangers. I walked down the dark hallway, dragging my feet just a little, but with my back straighter than it had been in a decade. I walked into my narrow room. I didn't turn on the light. I grabbed the cold metal doorknob and pulled the door shut. The click of the deadbolt sliding into place was dry, final, slicing cleanly through the fake laughter echoing from the living room. I sat on the bed in the dark, listening as they began to serve themselves, the banquet I had built. They had no idea of the vacuum they had just created. They didn't know that when this door clicked shut, the engine keeping their entire world alive had just been permanently turned off. In the darkness of my room, the silence hummed in my ears, but it didn't last long. Barely seconds after the deadbolt slid into place, the noise from the living room began bleeding through the thin drywall. I could hear the sharp clinking of fine crystal during toasts, the deep baritones of men talking business, the rehearsed, breathy laughs of the women. I heard Robert's voice, booming and confident, dominating the space that Arthur and I had built with so many years of sacrifice and early mornings. "A toast to new beginnings, Mr. Morrison," my son-in-law's voice echoed down the hall. "And to the partnerships that will take us to the next level. Please, consider this house your own." He said it with a mouth full of pride, giving away a space that didn't belong to him. Standing on floors I had polished on my hands and knees, I stayed seated on the edge of the mattress, feeling the sharp sting of the blister on my right arm, where the boiling caramel had caught me hours ago. I raised my hand in the gloom and touched the wound with my index finger. The pain was sharp, clean, real. It anchored me to the present. For the last 5 years, ever since I closed Arthur's eyes for the last time in the hospital, I had been living in a voluntary coma. I had walked the halls of my own home asking for permission, making myself small so I wouldn't be in the way, swallowing insults with the pathetic hope that my submission would buy my daughter's love and my grandchildren's peace. But Robert's shove, that heavy hand on my shoulder, treating me like a stray dog being shooed from the porch, had broken the spell. And Valerie's silence, her eyes glued to the marble floor while her husband humiliated me, had swept up the remaining pieces. I stood up. My knees popped, with their usual dull crunch, but this time I paid them no mind. I switched on the small bedside lamp, resting on the cheap, particle board nightstand. The yellow light washed over my refuge, a twin bed, a flimsy wardrobe Robert bought to replace my antique vanity, and a shoebox tucked into the corner. I walked to the wardrobe. I pulled open the doors, which squeaked slightly from the humidity. There, hanging on a wire hanger, was my burgundy dress. I ran my fingertips over the fabric. It was a simple cut, 3/4 sleeves, a modest neckline, but the material had a weight to it that made me feel secure. I had bought it with my own savings to wear tonight, to sit at the table surrounded by my family. I took it off the hanger. I kicked off my worn slippers. I untied the wool robe that smelled like smoke, fried onions, and lonely mornings, letting it drop onto the unmade bed. I dressed myself with slow, methodical movements. I pulled the zipper up my back, feeling the fabric conform to my tired frame. I sat back down to put on my low black heels, fastening the straps over my swollen insteps. I walked over to the small mirror hanging on the back of the door. I brushed my white hair, pinning it back with a couple of dark bobby pins. I didn't put on makeup. I've never liked it. but I pinched my cheeks gently to bring some color back to them. I didn't look sad. Exhausted, yes. Deep shadows carved circles under my eyes, but there was a new hardness in my jawline. I was no longer the frightened widow surrendering her space. I knelt by the bed and pulled out the shoebox. Inside was my real life, the one they ignored. I pulled out a small but sturdy black leather purse Arthur had given me for our anniversary. Into the purse went my ID, the debit card where my modest monthly pension was deposited, the original keys to the house, and a manila envelope folded in half. Inside that envelope was the deed to the property, in my name, free and clear of any liens. Robert had never asked for it directly, but he had been dropping hints for months about regularizing the paperwork to put the house in Valerie's name. I never gave it to him. That envelope was my invisible shield. I also dropped in Arthur's wristwatch and a silver rosary. I zipped the purse and slung it over my shoulder. The plan didn't form in my head in words. It formed in clear, absolute impulses. If they wanted me invisible, I would be invisible. If my presence was a roadblock to their perfect evening, I would remove my presence entirely. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I walked to my bedroom door and pressed my ear to the wood. The party was in full swing. The jazz music Robert always played to seem sophisticated was humming at a moderate volume. The voices were concentrated in the living room and the foyer. The dining room and the kitchen, located in the opposite wing, had to be deserted. I gripped the cold doorknob, turning it painfully slow so the latch wouldn't click, and opened the door just enough to peek out. The hallway was dark. The warm, bright light spilled from the archway, connecting to the main living area. I stepped out, walking on the balls of my feet so my heels wouldn't click against the hardwood. I glided past the living room archway without stopping, but out of the corner of my eye, I caught the scene. Robert was standing by the unlit fireplace, holding a whiskey on the rocks, flashing all his teeth as he charmed a gray-haired man in an immaculate suit. Valerie was sitting on the white leather sofa, legs crossed, nodding at whatever the partner's wife was saying, laughing that high, hollow laugh she reserved for strangers. The kids were nowhere in sight, probably banished upstairs so they wouldn't interrupt adult conversation. It was pristine, a magazine lie. I reached the swinging kitchen door and pushed it gently with my shoulder. The temperature shift was immediate. The thick heat of recently turned-off ovens still hung in the air, laced with the deep aroma of spices, roasted meat, and cinnamon. I only turned on the small light above the stove hood, leaving the rest of the kitchen cloaked in shadows so the light wouldn't bleed under the door into the hall. I walked up to the granite center island. There sat the heavy glass Pyrex dishes Robert had forced me to use. In one rested the pork roast, bathing in its dark, thick glaze. In the other, massive and golden, sat the 22-pound turkey I had massaged, injected, and baked since 4 a.m. Off to the side, covered in aluminum foil, were the 2 vanilla custards, the mashed potatoes, and the apple salad. I stared at the food. My food. Robert had bought the ingredients for the side dishes and the pork. That was true. But the turkey, that 22-pound giant that was the star of the night, I had paid for out of my own pocket. I don't have cash on me, Eleanor. You pay for it, and I'll reimburse you tomorrow, he had told me at the farmer's market last week. Tomorrow never came. As usual. The ingredients for the desserts also came out of my coin purse, penny by penny, bought at the corner bodega because Valerie forgot to put them on her grocery list. I opened the bottom pantry drawers. I didn't think twice. I pulled out 3 heavy-duty canvas grocery bags. I walked straight to the glass dish holding the turkey. I grabbed a large metal serving spoon and a carving fork. Instead of taking the heavy glass that belonged to my son-in-law, I reached under the counter and pulled out the chipped blue enamel roasting pan he had ordered me to hide because it looked miserable. With a swift, expert motion, I stabbed the carving fork into the turkey breast and used the spoon to support it from underneath. It weighed a ton. My wrists trembled under the strain, but rage gave me a strength I thought I'd lost. I hoisted the perfect bird out of the elegant glass and dropped it into my beat-up enamel pot. The sound of the hot meat settling against the aluminum gave me immense satisfaction. I tipped the Pyrex, pouring every drop of the pan drippings over the turkey, leaving his expensive glass dish completely empty and smeared with grease. I covered the enamel roaster with a double layer of foil, crimping the edges tight, and lowered it into the first canvas bag. I went for the desserts. The two metal molds holding the custards, cold and flawless, slid into the second bag. I grabbed an airtight Tupperware container from the cupboard and scraped every last bit of the apple salad into it, making sure not to leave a single walnut behind. I left the pork roast, the mashed potatoes, and the mac and cheese untouched. After all, Robert had paid for those. Let them eat the sides. Let them celebrate their million-dollar deals, chewing on cold pasta and pork. I was just finishing tying the handles of the canvas bags together when a sharp noise froze the blood in my veins. Someone had pushed the swinging door. I turned slowly, hiding the bags behind the center island, resting my hands flat against the cold granite. It was Robert. He marched into the kitchen, his face flushed from alcohol and adrenaline, carrying an empty silver ice bucket. He didn't turn on the main light. He just walked straight toward the refrigerator. When he saw me standing there in the shadows, he stopped dead. His eyes scanned my burgundy dress, my polished shoes, my brushed hair. His expression morphed from surprise to deep irritation in a fraction of a second. "Eleanor, what the hell are you doing dressed like that?" he hissed, dropping his voice into a furious whisper and closing the distance with heavy steps. "Didn't I tell you explicitly to go to bed? I don't want you hovering around when we're eating." My pulse was pounding in my throat, but my face betrayed absolutely nothing. I didn't step back a single inch. "I came for a glass of water," I replied, my voice so flat and icy I barely recognized it myself. Robert let out a scoff of impatience and slammed the silver bucket onto the granite counter, barely 2 feet away from the empty glass dishes he hadn't even raised. Yet noticed in the dim light. "Well, drink your water and get the hell back to your room," he ordered, pointing a finger at the door. "Mr. Morrison loves the house. I'm bringing them into the dining room in 10 minutes. Listen to me very closely, Eleanor. In 10 minutes, I am coming in here to get the turkey and the food. Fill this bucket to the top with ice, leave it on the counter, and turn the oven on to warm up the crescent rolls. Do not step foot in the hallway for any reason. Do you understand me? I will carry the plates out myself. I am not having my guests watch my mother-in-law wait tables." I looked at him. The man sleeping under the roof my husband built. The man eating out of my pots, giving me orders like I was a trespasser in my own sanctuary. "Of course, Robert," I said, dragging out the syllables with deliberate slowness. "I'll take care of the ice." He spun around, pushed through the swinging door, and vanished back into the noise and lights of his counterfeit world. I was completely alone. The kitchen clock read 8:20 p.m. He had exactly 10 minutes before the house of cards collapsed on top of him. I didn't touch the ice bucket. I didn't turn on the oven. I didn't take the crescent rolls out of their plastic bag. I grabbed the handles of the 3 heavy canvas bags. The weight of the turkey in the first bag was brutal. It forced my body to tilt to one side, straining the muscles in my neck and back. The other 2 bags, holding the custards and the salad, dangled from my left arm. I walked toward the back door of the kitchen, the one that opened into the small utility patio, and from there, into the side alley connecting to the main street. It was the door we used to take out the trash, the delivery entrance, the exit for the invisibles. It was the perfect exit for me. I slid back the rusted iron deadbolt with my free hand. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The freezing December wind hit my face like a comforting slap. The contrast against the stifling kitchen heat made me let out a long sigh. I stepped onto the concrete patio, dragging my right foot just a bit under the heavy load. I didn't lock the door behind me. I just pulled it shut until I heard the metallic click of the latch. I walked down the side alley in pitch darkness, letting my feet rely on memory. When I reached the sidewalk, the yellow glow of the street lamps lit my way. The neighborhood was a ghost town. On Christmas Eve at this hour, every family was locked inside their homes, celebrating, eating, laughing. The silence on the street was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my own shoes against the dead leaves and the soft panting of my breath. I didn't have a destination in mind when I left my room, but as I walked down the cracked pavement of my subdivision, my feet automatically carried me toward the only place I knew the doors would be open. St. Jude's Parish was only 5 blocks away. It was the church where Arthur and I had gotten married, where we had baptized Valerie, and where I spent my Thursday afternoons volunteering at the community pantry. The walk was physical agony. By the second block, the canvas handles were biting into my palms, cutting off circulation until my fingers went numb. I had to stop leaning against a lamppost, rest the turkey bag on a low brick wall, and massage my hands. The cold was sinking into my bones through the thin fabric of my burgundy dress, but my soul didn't feel cold. On the contrary, with every step that took me further from my own house, I felt a heavy, ancient crust flaking off my chest. I was breathing clean air for the first time in years. I checked my watch. 8:28 p.m. At this exact second, Robert was likely pushing through the swinging kitchen door, rubbing his hands together, ready to carry his elegant glass dishes into the dining room. I could picture the scene with photographic clarity. I could see his arrogant smirk freezing as he flipped on the overhead light. I could see his eyes locking onto the empty glass dishes, smeared with grease and scraps. I could hear the dead silence in that kitchen as the realization hit him. There was no turkey. There was no dessert. There was no salad. And above all, there was no mother-in-law to scream at. A tiny, sharp, razor-thin smile pulled at the corner of my mouth. I picked up the bags and kept walking. In the distance, the stone facade of the parish came into view. The heavy wooden doors were thrown wide open, spilling a warm glow out onto the courtyard. The traditional midnight mass was still hours away, but I knew the adjacent parish hall was always active on nights like this. The women of the community organized a modest dinner for the neighborhood folks who had no family, for the lonely elderly, and the homeless who slept in the plaza. I climbed the 3 steps to the courtyard, my legs trembling from the effort. The weight of the food had drawn a cold sweat to my forehead, ruining my brushed hair, but I didn't care. I walked down the side corridor leading to the hall. The smell of hot spiced cider and melting wax hung in the air. As I crossed the threshold into the hall, the low hum of voices wrapped around me. There were a couple of long plastic folding tables, covered in shiny paper tablecloths. About 15 elderly people sat drinking from styrofoam cups, talking quietly. At the far end, near a makeshift kitchenette, stood Margaret. Margaret was a woman my age, also a widow, with boundless energy and a commanding voice that ran the church choir. She was wearing a white apron over a thick sweater, stirring a massive pot of hot cider with a wooden ladle. When she saw me walk in, carrying the heavy bags, practically dragging them across the tile floor, Ted dropped the ladle and ran toward me. "Good Lord, Eleanor, what are you doing here at this hour? And what are you carrying that's breaking your back?" Margaret exclaimed, immediately grabbing the bag holding the turkey to take the weight off me. The relief in my arms was so profound, I almost lost my balance. I leaned against the doorframe, taking deep breaths, feeling the blood rush back into my numb fingers. "I brought dinner, Margaret," I said, my voice a little raspy from the cold and the exhaustion. Margaret frowned in confusion. She hauled the heavy canvas bag over to one of the empty tables and began untying the knot. When she opened the bag, saw the massive blue enamel roaster, and peeled back a corner of the foil, releasing a cloud of golden steam and the rich scent of wine and spices into the room. Her eyes went wide. "Eleanor, this is a feast," she murmured, looking up at me. "What about your family? Your daughter? You told me on Sunday you had a full house, that your son-in-law invited the big bosses from his firm." "My son-in-law said he wanted a luxury dinner." "Margaret," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, without a single tremor in my voice. But he forgot that luxury isn't served on empty plates. And he forgot who owns the kitchen. She didn't need me to explain the details. She saw my dress, wrinkled from the labor. She saw the black leather purse strapped across my chest, holding my entire life. She understood exactly what I had just done. A smile of deep, silent complicity spread across Margaret's face. She nodded once, asking no more questions. "Well, you arrived right on time, Eleanor," Margaret announced loudly, drawing the attention of the elderly folks sitting at the nearby tables. "We have 20 people here who are going to eat like kings tonight. Bring me the knives. We need to carve this bird." I walked over to the table, pulled the carving fork out of the bag, and got ready to serve. Around me, the voices in the parish hall filled with genuine awe and gratitude. The human warmth instantly replaced the chill of the street. As I sliced the first piece of white meat, flawless and juicy, I heard the distant chime of the church bells striking 9 o'clock. Back at my house, 5 blocks away, the emotional time bomb had just detonated. Robert was standing in front of a granite island with empty hands, staring into the absolute abyss of his own arrogance, while his VIP guests sat waiting in the dining room, moments away from discovering that their host's castle was nothing but a hollow facade held up by the woman he had just thrown out. And I, for the first time in years, was going to eat in peace. The carving knife glided through the turkey breast with a buttery smoothness that only comes from hours of precise, slow roasting. The golden skin cracked under the blade, releasing a thick cloud of steam that smelled of white wine, oregano, and pan drippings. Across from me, on the other side of the plastic folding table, Mr. Henderson held a styrofoam plate with 2 trembling hands. His eyes, clouded with cataracts, were locked onto the thick slice of meat I had just cut. I took the large serving spoon, scooped up some of the dark juices pooling at the bottom of my old enamel pot, and drizzled it over the turkey. I handed him the plate. The old man nodded silently and shuffled slowly back to his folding chair. Behind him, Mrs. Higgins was already waiting her turn, clutching a paper napkin to her chest like a treasure. For the next 20 minutes, I did nothing but slice, serve, and portion. Margaret handled the desserts, popping the vanilla custards out of their molds onto paper plates, cutting exact slices so there would be enough for everyone. The parish hall, which half an hour ago had been a quiet, drafty room, was now alive with the sound of plastic forks scraping against plates, the low hum of conversation, and the warmth of 20 people who hadn't expected a thing from this night. I didn't serve myself right away. I stood behind the table, resting my hands on the hard plastic edge, watching the food that had cost me the skin on my fingers and the ache in my back disappear into the mouths of people who received it with reverence. No one here complained about the lack of crystal goblets. No one looked at my chipped blue pot with disgust. When the last plate was handed out, Margaret walked over to me with an insulated cup full of hot spiced cider. She pressed it into my hands and gently pushed my shoulder, guiding me toward an empty chair in the corner of the room. I sat down. The rigid plastic gave slightly under my weight. I felt the dull throb in my knees and the burning in the soles of my feet, but for the first time all day, I didn't feel the urge to jump back up and keep working. I took a sip of the cider. The hot, sweet liquid slipped down my throat, loosening a knot I didn't even realize had been pulled tight since 4 in the morning. I looked down at the hard seat I was resting on. That physical discomfort sent my mind drifting backward, to a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago, the day I lost my place to sit in my own home. I had walked to the farmer's market to buy the week's vegetables. I walked back in a cold drizzle, carrying 4 plastic bags that cut off the circulation in my fingers. When I opened the front door, I dropped the bags on the foyer floor to shake the water off my coat. That was when I looked into the living room. The space by the window, the corner that always caught the afternoon sun, was empty. There was a square indentation crushed into the carpet. It was the only trace left that an olive green recliner had ever been there. It was Arthur's chair. The same chair where he used to sit and read the paper, and where I had curled up to knit every night since he passed. I walked into the living room, my wet shoes staining the hardwood. Robert was standing against the wall, holding a metal tape measure, tapping numbers into his phone. I stopped in front of him. I asked him about the chair. My voice sounded small, drowned out by the rain hitting the glass. Robert didn't even look up from his screen. I had the trash guys haul it away, Eleanor. That piece of junk smelled like an old man and made the whole house look miserable. I'm buying a minimalist designer sofa for this corner. The firm's partners can't come over and see thrift store garbage. It was the chair where Arthur had held me when we found out Valerie was pregnant. It was the furniture I had hand-stitched myself to cover a tear. I spun around, looking for my daughter. Valerie was in the open-concept kitchen, her back to us, washing a pot that was already clean. The faucet was running at full blast, creating a deafening roar she used as a shield so she wouldn't have to hear me. "Valerie," I called out from the living room. She didn't turn around. Her shoulders tensed under her silk blouse, but she didn't shut off the water. She let the noise drown out my protest. She let Robert erase the memory of her father, and my only place to rest, all in the name of a minimalist sofa I was never allowed to sit on. That afternoon, I picked up my bags of vegetables from the floor, walked into the kitchen, passed right behind my daughter without touching her, and locked myself in my room. I never sat in the living room again after that day. A sharp, persistent vibration snapped me violently back to the present in the parish hall. It was coming from inside the black leather purse strapped across my chest. I reached in, pushing past the manila envelope holding my house deed, and pulled out the cell phone. It was a cheap, small-screen burner Robert had handed me a year ago, claiming it was for emergencies, and for texting me grocery lists when he was at the office. The screen lit up the shadows in my corner. The clock read 9:15 p.m. Beneath the time, a name flashed in large red letters. Robert. The phone buzzed against my palm like a trapped insect. I didn't answer. I just stared at the screen, watching the name disappear, replaced by a notification. 14 missed calls, 8 from Robert, 6 from Valerie. Barely 3 seconds of silence passed before the device started vibrating again. This time, the name on the screen was Valerie. Margaret, who was clearing empty plates from the nearest table, noticed the glow of the phone in my hands. She walked over slowly, drying her hands on her white apron, and stood next to me. She looked at the screen, then looked at my face. "They're calling," Margaret whispered. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. "Yes," I replied, never taking my eyes off my daughter's name. "Do you want me to turn it off for you, Eleanor? I can lock it in the priest's office drawer. That way you don't have to hear it." I didn't want to see it ring. I could picture Robert in the kitchen, his tie yanked loose, his face red with panic and fury, tearing open empty ovens, staring at grease-smeared glass dishes, realizing there was no turkey, no dessert, no magic. I could imagine Valerie locked in the powder room, dialing my number over and over with trembling fingers, terrified of the public humiliation her husband was about to suffer in front of the men who were supposed to change his life. They were desperately searching for the invisible maid, but the maid wasn't there. The phone stopped ringing. The screen went black, handing me back to the darkness. I rested my thumb over the side button to power the device down completely. But before I could press it, a new call came through. Valerie. The glowing name tugged at another thread of memory, forcing me to recall the exact moment I realized my daughter no longer saw me as a mother, but as just another piece of furniture in the house. Just like Arthur's green chair. It happened exactly 1 year ago, last Christmas Eve. I had caught severe bronchitis in early December. The cough rattled my chest in the middle of the night, a dry, agonizing hack that left me gasping for air. I had been confined to the bed in my narrow room for 3 days, burning with a fever, sweating through the blankets. I barely had the strength to stand up and pour myself a glass of water. It was the evening of December 23rd. Robert was hosting a holiday mixer for the executives at his firm. I could hear the soft music and laughter bleeding through the walls. My throat felt like ground glass. I could barely swallow. During a particularly violent coughing fit, I sat up on the edge of the bed, fighting to pull air into my inflamed lungs. The noise I made must have echoed down the hall. My bedroom door cracked open just a few inches. A sliver of yellow hallway light sliced through the darkness of my room, stinging my eyes. It was Valerie. She was wearing a blue velvet dress, holding a half-empty glass of wine. I thought she was bringing me cough syrup. I thought she had hot tea, or at least, that she was coming to ask how I felt. I reached a trembling hand out toward her in the gloom. Valerie didn't step inside. She stood in the doorway, blocking the light with her body. "Mom," she hissed, her voice tight with urgency, the exact same tone Robert used when something annoyed him. "Please, try not to cough so loud. Or put a pillow over your face. Robert's boss is in the living room, and we can hear you all the way out there. It's a really bad look to have someone sick in the house. Robert is very on edge." I couldn't answer. Another coughing fit seized my throat. I clutched my chest, hunching over my own knees. "Thanks, Mom. Try to sleep," Valerie said quickly, and without taking a single step into the room. Without handing me the empty water glass sitting on my nightstand, she pulled the door shut. The click of the latch was identical to the one I had made myself tonight when I walked out. I was left in the dark, coughing into a thick blanket to muffle the sound, feeling cold sweat drip down my neck. The fever made me hallucinate a little that night. I dreamed Arthur was sitting at the foot of my bed, looking at me with an ocean of sadness in his eyes. When I woke up the next morning, the fever had broken, but something inside me had frozen solid forever. I got up, went to the kitchen, cooked Christmas Eve dinner in silence, and never confronted Valerie about what she did. I just took that memory and buried it in the exact same place I buried Robert's insults, deep in the pit of my stomach. But now, watching the phone screen glow with her name, I knew the pit of my stomach was full. There wasn't room for a single drop of contempt more. The phone buzzed one last time, and the call dropped. Without waiting for them to dial again, I pressed the power button on the side. The screen asked me to confirm. I tapped it. The device gave a short, final vibration, and the screen went dead black. I dropped it back into the bottom of my leather purse, under the envelope with the deed. I looked up. The parish hall was beginning to empty out. Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Higgins had gotten up and were shuffling slowly toward the exit, buttoning up threadbare coats, wishing a good night to Father Reynolds, who had just walked in through the side door. The priest was an older man with snow-white hair and a slow gait, a man who knew every single soul in the neighborhood by their first name. He walked over to the table where Margaret and I were sitting. He looked at the empty pots, the stacked plastic plates, and then he looked at me. "They tell me we dined on royal food tonight, Eleanor," Father Reynolds said, his deep voice echoing off the clean walls of the hall. "The turkey was so tender, Mr. Henderson didn't even need his dentures. It was a special recipe," I replied softly. "Margaret tells me you carried all of this here yourself." He knew the house was in my name. He knew about Arthur's death, and he had noticed how I stopped coming to Sunday Mass, because Robert demanded breakfast served promptly at 9 a.m. The old priest rested a hand on my shoulder and nodded slowly. "Pride is a very tall building, Eleanor, but its foundation is incredibly fragile. Your son-in-law built his floor on your shoulders. When you step out of the way, he falls. That's not revenge, that's just gravity." Outside, the street was pitch black. The freezing air fogged the windows. Going back to my room, that cramped box next to the laundry, meant facing Robert's screaming, Valerie's manipulative sobbing, and their demands that I fix the disaster they had brought upon themselves. It meant going back to being the maid. "I'm not going back," I said. And as I said the words out loud, I felt them turn to stone. It wasn't just a thought anymore. It was a fact. Not tonight, not tomorrow. That house is mine. The bricks are mine. But the hell they built inside it belongs to them. Let them keep it a little longer. You're taking a hot shower. I'm loaning you a clean nightgown. And you are sleeping in a real bed, Margaret declared. I walked over to the aluminum sink in the corner of the hall. I turned on the cold tap and started washing my old blue enamel pot. The freezing water numbed my hands instantly, but the mechanical act of scrubbing away the grease with a sponge brought my calm back. I washed every container, every serving spoon, drying them with paper towels. Margaret helped me pack everything back into the canvas bags, which were now completely empty. The bags weighed nothing. It was nearly 10 at night when we left the parish. Father Reynolds pulled the heavy wooden doors shut behind us, locking the corridor. Margaret and I walked down the sidewalk in the opposite direction of my house. The freezing December wind whipped my face, but I didn't shiver. I walked with my back straight, keeping my black leather purse pressed against my body. Margaret's apartment was only 2 blocks away. It was a modest building with peeling paint and polished concrete stairs. We walked up to the second floor in silence. Margaret unlocked the door, flipped on the light in a narrow hallway, and led me to a small bedroom that smelled of lavender and bleach. It had a full-sized bed with a hand-crocheted quilt, a light wood closet, and a small window looking out into an interior courtyard. The bathroom is at the end of the hall, Margaret said, handing me a thick towel and a white flannel nightgown. Take your time. The hot water takes a minute to kick in, but it gets plenty hot. There was a hard, bright, cold spark in my eyes. I turned the shower handle and let the steam fill the small bathroom. I carefully unzipped the back of my burgundy dress and stepped out of it. I kicked off the shoes that were pinching my swollen feet. I stepped under the scalding water. The shock of the heat hitting my freezing skin pulled a muffled groan from my throat. The water cascaded down my back, over my aching knees, over my exhausted wrists. I closed my eyes and stood dead still under the spray for 15 minutes, letting the smell of garlic, fried onions, and early morning sweat circle the drain. When I stepped out, I dried off slowly. I pulled Margaret's flannel nightgown over my head. It was a little baggy, but incredibly soft. I walked back to the guest room. Margaret had left a steaming mug of chamomile tea on the nightstand and turned on the bedside lamp. She had already retired to her own room. I sat on the edge of the bed. The black leather purse was resting on a chair by the door. I reached over, unbuckled the strap, unzipped it, and reached inside. The dead phone was still at the bottom, useless and silenced. My fingers brushed past it and found the manila envelope. I pulled it out. I sat back on the bed and opened the envelope under the yellow glow of the lamp. I pulled out the thick pages of paper, stamped and notarized over 30 years ago. I ran my thumb over the notary's seal, and the name printed in bold capital letters, Eleanor Vance, sole owner. I didn't need a lawyer to understand what I was holding. I didn't need a judge to reclaim my space. The power didn't live in the paper itself. It lived in the fact that Robert, in his boundless arrogance, had completely forgotten whose ground he was standing on. He believed the money he made at his firm bought him the rights to a castle he didn't own. He believed I was a ghost, tolerated out of charity. Tomorrow morning, that mirage was going to shatter. Tomorrow, they would have to face the daylight. With the hangover of a ruined dinner, with the humiliation still fresh in their minds, and with the undeniable proof that they controlled absolutely nothing. I folded the deed carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. I put it in the black leather purse and shoved the purse under my pillow. I slid between the clean sheets that smelled of lavender. The mattress was firm. The room was perfectly silent. There were no heavy footsteps stomping down the hall, no demands from Valerie, no ambient noise from a house that had been sucking my blood drop by drop. I turned off the lamp. In the dark, I curled up on my side, wrapping my arms around myself under the blankets. My muscles, wound tight for years, finally began to unspool. As sleep pulled me under, a crystal-clear image formed in my mind. I pictured the moment the sun came up. I pictured Robert waking up in a trashed house, surrounded by dirty glass dishes, and silence, believing the worst punishment had already passed with tonight's ruined dinner. He had no idea that the real blow wasn't the food I took. The real blow was the door I was going to open tomorrow when I went back to finish what I started. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time in half a decade, I slept straight through the night. The sliver of sunlight slipping through the gap in the curtains hit me right in the eyes. I didn't know what time it was at first. My body, trained for decades to spring up like a coiled wire in the pitch black of 4 a.m., was anchored by a heavy, warm lethargy that kept me glued to the mattress. I wiggled my fingers under the crocheted quilt. My joints ached, a dull reminder of yesterday's titanic effort, but the pain in my chest, that constant tightness that cut off my air every time I heard Robert walking down the hall, was entirely gone. I turned my head toward the nightstand. Margaret's small alarm clock read 9:15 a.m. 9:15. It had been at least 30 years since I had seen the morning sun from a bed. I sat up slowly. The white flannel brushed against the blister on my right forearm, pulling a sharp hiss from my teeth. The caramel burn was raised and throbbing, but I didn't care anymore. It was a battle scar, the last mark that kitchen would ever leave on my skin. I swung my bare feet onto the clean linoleum floor. There was no rush. No one was screaming that the coffee was cold. No one was demanding I iron a shirt or hide my old pots. The silence in Margaret's apartment was a silence of peace, entirely different from the tense, venomous quiet of my own house. I stood up, slipped on my low black heels, and walked to the door. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and buttered toast filled the narrow hallway. Margaret was sitting at the table in wool slacks and a gray sweater, reading an old newspaper, with half-moon reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. In front of her were 2 steaming mugs and a plate of pastries. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Margaret said, not looking up from the paper, but with a clear smile in her voice. "I thought I was going to have to go in there and check your pulse. You slept like a rock." Her dark eyes held a gleam of complicity mixed with pure amusement. She leaned her elbows on the table and leaned toward me, dropping her voice as if someone might overhear us. "The neighborhood group chat was blowing up until 2 a.m., Eleanor," she murmured, tapping her cell phone resting next to the pastry plate. "Earl, the night watchman for your block, saw the whole thing. He sent me a private message at midnight because he knows we're friends. He said your son-in-law's VIP guests started walking out of the house at 8:45 p.m. They weren't even there a full hour. Earl said the gray-haired man, the boss your son-in-law was trying to impress, stormed out, walking fast toward his black SUV. Margaret kept going, gesturing with her hands. The man's wife was right behind him, her face red with fury, buttoning up her coat. Your son-in-law ran out to the sidewalk in his shirt sleeves, begging them to stay, saying there was a mix-up with the catering company, that they could order food from a restaurant. Earl said the boss stopped dead, looked him up and down, and yelled right there in the street, "A man who sits me at a table with empty plates and lies to my face about an imaginary banquet is not a man I'm trusting with my firm's money." They got in the SUV and left him standing there, freezing on the curb. It wasn't a laugh of joy that escaped me, but the release of immense pressure. Robert had built his own gallows. I had simply refused to braid the rope that held him up. He had tried to sell an image of perfection, an illusion of absolute control, but that illusion required my constant sweat, my flawless invisibility. The moment I removed my presence, his house of cards didn't just collapse. It crushed him, in front of the only people he cared about. "And your daughter?" Margaret asked, shifting to a softer tone, watching my reaction. "Valerie chose her side a long time ago, Margaret," I replied, staring into the dark depths of my coffee mug. "Yesterday, she watched me get humiliated and stared at the floor. Today, she's going to have to stare at the disaster left behind." "I'm going to the house," I announced from the hallway. Margaret poked her head out of the kitchen, frowning. "Are you sure, Eleanor? That man must be like a rabid dog right now. If you want, I can call my son to go with you. I just want to see with my own eyes what happens when the invisible maid actually disappears. I looked at the Christmas decorations in the neighbors' windows, the dead lights, the spent firework casings on the asphalt. The whole world seemed to be sleeping off a holiday hangover. Everyone, except house number 42. I reached the side alley of my property. The service door I had pushed shut the night before was exactly as I left it. No one had bothered to lock the deadbolt. No one had even realized which way the turkey had escaped. I pushed the rusted metal and stepped into the small concrete patio. I opened the back door and walked into the kitchen. The visual impact was immediate, but the smell was worse. The kitchen, my spotless sanctuary of white tile, looked like it had been ransacked. The air reeked of stale alcohol, cigarette smoke, and desperation. I flicked on the fluorescent overhead light. The granite center island was littered with half-empty crystal glasses, dead wine bottles, and sticky puddles of spilled liquor that had already dried. Sitting in the dead center of the counter, like monuments to sheer stupidity, were the massive glass Pyrex dishes Robert had forced me to use. They were filthy, smeared with turkey grease and the sugary juice of the apple salad, but utterly empty. The floor was covered in breadcrumbs. Someone, likely Robert in his blind panic, had tried to pull the raw crescent rolls out of their plastic bags, but abandoned them half-baked on a baking sheet, now resting lopsided over the sink. There were cigarette ashes in the butter dish. The trash can was overflowing with crumpled, stained linen napkins. I walked through the wreckage, feeling my soles stick slightly to the filthy floor. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the overwhelming urge to grab a mop and start cleaning. I felt a deep, icy satisfaction. This was their true capacity for survival. This is what they achieved when my hands weren't there to fix their mistakes before anyone noticed them. I stopped in front of the swinging door leading to the hallway. From upstairs, the sound of raised voices began bleeding down. They were muffled by distance, but loaded with poisonous fury. "I told you to control her, Valerie. I told you to keep her locked in her damn room." It was Robert's voice. It sounded raw, shredded, bordering on hysteria. "She ruined me. Morrison blocked my number this morning. He called me a clown, a starving beggar who can't even afford decent catering. He eats on my dime," Robert roared, and the sound of something heavy smashing against the master bedroom wall shook the ceiling above my head. And look at us now. The firm's contract is garbage. My partners think I'm bankrupt because I served them cold bread and cheap wine at an empty table. Make her come back. Call her right now and tell her to come clean up this pigsty before my parents get here at noon. He wanted the invisible machinery to turn back on because he was entirely incapable of operating his own life. I pushed the swinging door open with a flat palm and stepped into the foyer. The dining room was worse than the kitchen. My mother's white linen tablecloth, the one I had ironed with such care, was ruined with red wine stains. Crystal goblets were strewn everywhere. The wooden chairs were shoved out of place, some knocked over. It looked like the scene of a panicked evacuation. I started walking toward my bedroom at the end of the hall. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. I didn't bother walking on my tiptoes. I didn't bother hiding my presence. The sharp clatter of my shoes echoed up to the second floor. The screaming stopped dead. There was a heavy, pregnant silence, followed by the frantic thumping of footsteps rushing down the marble staircase. I reached my bedroom door, but before I could turn the knob, Robert's voice boomed behind me. "Eleanor." His eyes were bloodshot, bulging from lack of sleep and bottled-up rage. Right behind him, stepping off the last stair, was Valerie. She was wearing a wrinkled silk robe. Mascara smeared down her cheeks, her eyes swollen from crying. Robert closed the distance in 3 heavy strides. He stopped 3 feet away, invading my personal space, puffing his chest out in a pathetic attempt to claw back the authority he lost last night. "Where the hell were you?" he spat, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Do you have any idea what you did? Do you have any idea the humiliation you put me through in front of the most important man in this city?" I looked at him with the same clinical detachment one uses to watch a bug flailing on its back. You asked me not to be an obstacle, Robert. I said, my voice so level and calm it seemed to destabilize him even more. You screamed at me in front of my daughter to disappear, to get out. I have never, in all these years, been so obedient. He clenched his fists at his sides. You stole the food, my food. I paid for those ingredients. If you weren't capable of serving cold pork on your glass plates, that is your problem, not mine. Clean the living room. Robert's parents are coming at 1 p.m. to eat leftovers, and we don't have anything. Help us fix this. It was Valerie, begging me to scrub her husband's filth, to save face in front of her in-laws. I looked my daughter up and down. I saw the smeared makeup, the expensive robe, the absolute uselessness of her manicured hands. You are a mother, Valerie, I told her, my words slicing through the cold air of the hallway like razor blades. You have 2 perfectly healthy hands. Go into the kitchen, grab a frying pan, and cook breakfast for your children. And if the house is dirty, pick up a broom. You are old enough to know how it works. Don't speak to my wife like that, Robert cut in, taking another step forward, trying to use his sheer size to intimidate me. You don't give orders here. Look at you. You look like a vagrant in those borrowed clothes. You are going to walk into that kitchen right now. You are going to take out the trash. You are going to set the dining room, and you are going to cook something for my parents. And if you don't, I swear to God, Eleanor, I will pack up your garbage tomorrow and throw you in a nursing home. This is my house, and under my roof, things are done the way I say. I didn't pull the manila envelope out of my purse. I didn't show him the notary's signature. I didn't need to stoop to debating property law with a man who didn't even know how to sweep up his own mess. His punishment wasn't losing the title to the house. His punishment was having to live in it without me. Don't worry about packing my things, Robert, I replied, turning my back to him and opening my bedroom door. I already did. Robert and Valerie stood paralyzed in the exact same spot, staring at me with a cocktail of disbelief and rising panic. The sharp, high-pitched wail of my grandson, Leo, drifted down the stairs. Mom, I'm hungry. Mia spilled milk on the carpet, the boy screamed from the second floor. Valerie flinched at the sound, looking up the stairs and then back at me, her eyes begging. Where are you going, Mom? You can't leave us like this. You can't. Go play the victim somewhere else. We don't need you. I can hire 3 maids better than you tomorrow morning. Maybe you can pay for 3 maids. Robert, I said, keeping my voice low, making sure every syllable nailed itself into the silence of the hallway. But nobody is going to give you back the contract you lost yesterday, and nobody is going to give your guests back the respect they lost for you. When they saw you're nothing but a hollow man, surrounded by empty plates. You didn't kick me out of your dinner. You freed me from your misery. I grabbed the brass handle of the heavy front door. I turned it, pulled the heavy wood toward me, and stepped out onto the small front porch. The freezing Christmas morning wind wrapped around me instantly, tossing my white hair, but the black leather purse pressed against my chest radiated a deep heat. I didn't pull the door shut gently. I slammed it with everything I had, letting the impact echo through the entire house. A definitive, thunderous crash that rattled the window panes. As I walked down the stone path to the sidewalk, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering against the floor inside the house, followed by Robert's frustrated, desperate scream and Valerie's uncontrollable sobbing. The chaos had just begun. The invisible machinery had been unplugged forever, and the vacuum it left behind was massive enough to swallow them whole. They were trapped in the hellfire of their own incompetence, with the in-laws about to arrive to a filthy house, with no food, no contract, and no maid. And I, with my aching knees and my borrowed dress, walked down the empty street, feeling, for the first time in my entire life, absolutely invincible. The walk back to Margaret's apartment was one of the strangest, most revealing walks of my life. The icy Christmas morning wind hit me straight in the face, slipping down the collar of my borrowed coat. But it didn't make me shiver once. With every step I took over the cracked sidewalks of the neighborhood, the echo of the door I had just slammed reverberated in my memory. A dry, heavy, blunt sound that had put a hard stop to a solid decade of silence and submission. My low black heels, the same ones I had polished so carefully for a party I was never invited to, tapped a steady, rhythmic beat against the leaf-strewn asphalt. I didn't feel cold in my soul. The black leather purse, strapped tightly across my chest, pulsed against my ribs like a second heartbeat. Inside it, I carried my identity, my freedom, and the undeniable proof that the ground Robert walked on with such arrogance actually belonged to me. The remnants of Christmas Eve fireworks stained the pavement in gray patches of burnt powder. Passing the neighbors' windows, I could see the blinking lights of Christmas trees glowing inside warm, tidy living rooms, where families were surely sleeping off a happy night. I didn't have a family like that. Mine had mutated into a nest of demands and contempt, a theater of appearances held up by my sweat. But as I turned the corner and lost sight of the facade of my own house, I felt a massive crust flake off my back. I no longer had to cook for anyone who wouldn't say thank you. I no longer had to shrink myself in the hallways of my own home. I reached Margaret's building and climbed the polished concrete stairs with an agility I hadn't felt in years. When I unlocked the apartment door, the smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast welcomed me back. Margaret was still in the cramped kitchen, washing the breakfast plates. When she heard the deadbolt click, she dried her hands quickly on her apron and stepped into the hall, looking me up and down with wide eyes, as if she expected to see me covered in bruises. "What happened, Eleanor?" she asked, stepping close to grab me by the elbows. "Did that animal do something to you? You're pale." "He didn't do anything to me, Margaret," I answered, feeling a tiny, involuntary smile pull at the corners of my mouth. "The kitchen is a landfill. The glass dishes he forced me to use are sitting right in the middle of the island, stained and empty." Robert was losing his mind, screaming that he lost the deal of a lifetime because his boss humiliated him in front of his wife. What did Valerie do? A 35-year-old woman crying because she doesn't know how to turn on the stove to feed her own children. The shamelessness of those people has no limit. I slammed the door and left them to burn in their own hell. My knees hurt. My lower back throbbed. And the blister on my right forearm, where the boiling caramel had hit me, popped and formed a dark scab that Margaret treated with burn ointment every night. The cheap burner phone Robert had given me stayed powered off and buried at the bottom of my leather purse. I had no interest in knowing how many times they called. I had no interest in listening to the threats or the begging. My absence was my only answer. On December 28th, I finally put my shoes on and walked out to the street. I didn't go to the church or the market. I went straight to the municipal utility offices. For years, ever since Arthur was alive, every bill for that house was in my name. The electricity, the water, the gas, and even the high-speed internet package Robert demanded for his business video calls were set to auto-pay from my debit card, from the pension Arthur had left me. Robert never offered to pay them, and I, desperate to keep the peace, never asked him to. I walked into the utility company. I pulled a paper ticket and waited on a hard plastic chair. When the clerk at the window called my number, I slid her my ID and the account number. "I need to cancel the auto-pay, sweetheart," I told her, my voice steady, "and I want to terminate the service in my name. I don't live at that address anymore." If my presence was an obstacle, then my money and my signature were too. From that moment on, house number 42 would have to hold itself up with the money of the man who thought he owned it. The months began to pass with a sweet, healing slowness. I stayed living with Margaret. We agreed to split the apartment's expenses, and to bring in a little extra cash, we started baking together. I wasn't roasting 22-pound turkeys for arrogant executives anymore. We baked sweet breads, pineapple empanadas, vanilla scones, and pecan cookies, which we sold to the neighbors and outside the Sunday services at St. Jude's. Cooking stopped being an act of slavery and went back to what it was when Arthur was alive, an act of love and self-reliance. It was mid-April, almost 4 months after that Christmas Eve, when the news finally caught up to us. Margaret and I were sitting on a bench in the church courtyard, arranging our baskets of pastries under white cloth napkins, when we saw Earl walking toward us. He was the night watchman for the subdivision where my house was located, an older man, skinny as a rail, who spent his nights walking the streets with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. Earl took off his faded cap when he saw us and sat on the edge of the stone planter across from us. I offered him a warm pineapple empanada. He took it with rough hands, took a massive bite, and chewed slowly before speaking. "Oh, Miss Eleanor, you have no idea what a disaster your house is," Earl began, brushing crumbs out of his gray mustache. "Ever since you left, that property looks abandoned. The front lawn is completely dead. Yellow, dried up. Nobody waters it. Trash bags pile up on the curb because Mr. Robert got into a screaming match with the sanitation crew. He called them starving beggars and refused to tip them for the holidays. So now, the garbage trucks just drive right past and won't pick up a thing. The stray dogs rip the bags open at night, and the whole alley stinks." "But that's not the worst part," Earl continued, dropping his voice and leaning in, adopting the confidential tone of neighborhood gossip. "Early February, the utility company cut their power. I saw it myself. The yellow truck pulled up and pulled the meter. Mr. Robert ran out in his boxers, screaming at the linemen, but they told him the account was 3 months past due. They sat in the dark for 4 days, lighting candles, until his daughter Valerie had to go pawn some jewelry to pay the reconnection fee and start a new account. Morrison, the man who came to the Christmas dinner and left furious. He made sure every door was slammed in his face. He badmouthed him to every partner in the firm. They fired him mid-January. Now Mr. Robert is driving around in a compact car, selling insurance on commission. The brand new SUV his daughter was driving got repossessed by the dealership because they stopped making payments. They spend all day screaming. You can hear the fights from the street, blaming each other for everything. I gave Earl 2 more empanadas, and he said his goodbyes, disappearing into the crowd starting to arrive for the 6 o'clock mass. The final test came in late August, on a sweltering afternoon when the sky was threatening to unleash a summer thunderstorm. I was in the small parish hall, putting away empty baking trays, when I heard the sound of heels dragging across the tile floor. I looked up. It was Valerie. I froze, holding an aluminum tray against my chest. My daughter stopped in the doorway. It took me several seconds to process the change in her appearance. She wasn't wearing silk dresses or designer shoes anymore. She wore faded jeans and a wrinkled cotton blouse. Her hair, once perfectly dyed and flat-ironed, showed 3 inches of dark roots and was pulled back into a sloppy ponytail. Her hands, gripping the strap of a cheap purse, had short, unpainted nails with edges chewed down by anxiety. She looked 10 years older. "Hi, Mom," Valerie whispered, her voice fragile, threatening to shatter at any second. "Hello, Valerie," I replied, not moving an inch. I didn't put the tray down. I didn't run to hug her. The woman standing in front of me had allowed me to be humiliated in my own home, and the damage of her silence couldn't be erased by a sad face. Valerie took 2 steps into the hall. She looked around, noticing the smell of burnt sugar and cinnamon hanging in the air, the exact same smell I used to leave in her kitchen every morning before they threw me out. "I've been looking for you," she said, swallowing hard. "I went to Margaret's place a few times, but she always told me you weren't there. Or she shut the door in my face. I need to talk to you, Mom. Please?" Robert hasn't had a steady job in months. The money he gets from commissions barely covers groceries. We had to pull the kids out of private school and put them in the public district. The house is falling apart. The water heater broke and we don't have the cash to fix it. We've been taking bucket showers with freezing water for weeks. We're 2 months behind on property taxes, and the credit cards are eating us alive. I let her empty her sack of miseries, listening to every detail of the ruin they had built for themselves. She looked at me with those big, wet eyes, waiting for maternal instinct to kick in, waiting for me to run to her with an open wallet, just like I had done so many times in the past. "We need your signature, Mom," she finally blurted out, getting to the real reason for her visit. She took another step, extending a trembling hand toward me. "We need you to sign a power of attorney or transfer the deed to Robert's name. If the house is in our name, we can take out a second mortgage or sell it to clear the debt and start a new business. I promise we'll give you a cut. I promise everything will be different." Robert learned his lesson. "He's so sorry. Please, Mom, don't leave us on the street. Do it for your grandkids." It was the exact same hand that hadn't moved a single inch to defend me when her husband shoved me into the dark hallway. It was the hand of the woman who asked me to put a pillow over my face to muffle my cough so I wouldn't bother her guests. The sheer audacity of coming to ask me for the deed to the house Arthur and I built, just to pay off the debts of her husband's arrogance, felt like a sick joke. No, I didn't yell it. It was a short, dry, absolute word. It dropped into the parish hall with the weight of a granite tombstone. Valerie blinked in confusion, slowly pulling her hand back. "No, Mom? I'm telling you, we are going to lose everything. I am begging you. You don't have anything to mortgage because it never belonged to you." Robert thought that by screaming the loudest, he became the owner, and you believed him. "But the paperwork is still in my purse. I am not signing anything. I am not signing away your father's legacy to save a man who treated me like garbage. You want to see us on the street? You want your grandkids sleeping under a bridge? At the end of the month, I am putting my house on the market. With the money, I am going to buy a small place for myself. The rest will go into a college trust for Leo and Mia when they come of age. They will never lack for anything, but I am not giving the two of you a single red cent." She realized it right then. The submissive mother, the invisible maid who solved every problem in silence, had died on Christmas Eve. The woman standing in front of her was not going to back down. Valerie turned around, her shoulders slumped, her face twisted in tears, and walked out of the hall dragging her feet. Exactly the way I had done when they kicked me out of my own kitchen. And that was it. 3 weeks later, a discount moving truck hauled away Robert's minimalist furniture, flat-screen TVs, and designer clothes. Earl told me they left in the dead of night with their heads down, rushing the suitcases out so the neighbors wouldn't see them. They left the keys under the front doormat. I hired a real estate agent. I cleaned the house with Margaret's help. I scrubbed the wine stains out of the dining room floor, reseeded the lawn, and sold it 2 months later to a large family with 3 dogs who filled the backyard with noise and life. It has been almost 3 years since that Christmas. The leap in time healed the physical wounds and erased the chronic exhaustion from my bones. I didn't use the sale money to buy a dark apartment or a back room on someone else's property. I bought a small, single-story house in a quiet neighborhood on the south side of the city. It's a modest house with massive windows that let the sunlight pour in from dawn to dusk, and a backyard where I planted rose bushes and pots of mint. Margaret moved in with me. We became business partners and life companions. We turned the spacious living room into our own baking studio. Now, we bake to order for local coffee shops and neighborhood events. We work at our own pace. No screaming, no rushing. No one ordering us to hide our tools. My new kitchen is my actual castle. The backsplash tiles are a pale blue that glows in the morning light. There are no heavy glass Pyrex dishes or cold granite islands, just pine tables, flowered rolling pins, and shelves lined with jars of spices I dry in the sun myself. My knees barely hurt anymore because I sit down to rest whenever my body asks for it, without feeling an ounce of guilt. It's Tuesday afternoon. The air outside is crisp, announcing the arrival of winter. I am standing at my stove, stirring the contents of a pot. It's not just any pot. It's the old, chipped blue enamel roaster, the exact same one I used to carry the turkey out that night, the one Robert called Misery. Inside it, the boiling caramel for the vanilla custards bubbles with a thick, sweet sound, releasing steam that smells of vanilla and toasted sugar. My hands move with skill, without pain. The white scar on my right forearm is barely visible now, blending in with the wrinkles earned by my age. I turn off the burner, grab the enamel pot by its thick handles, and slide it over to the table with a smooth motion. I wipe my hands on my white apron, spotless, without a single stain of someone else's grease. I walk toward the brightest corner of my living room, right next to the picture window overlooking the garden. There, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon, rests an olive green recliner. It's not Arthur's. That one was lost to the landfill a long time ago. But it's an identical match I spent weeks hunting down across 10 different antique stores until I found it. I sit down slowly. The soft cushion yields under my weight, embracing my tired back in absolute comfort. I stretch my legs out, close my eyes, and listen to the silence. There are no frantic phone calls, no heavy footsteps stomping down the stairs, no voices demanding perfection. The only sound is a bird singing in the rose bushes and the distant bubbling of caramel cooling in my kitchen. I smile in the fading light, take a deep breath, and finally, I rest in my own home.